All right, everyone. This is going to be the final chapter in Unit 7, the implementation stage. And this is Chapter 28, Development Management and Policy Implementation, Relevance Beyond the Global South. And this is by Derek and Jennifer Brinkerhoff. All right, Section 28.1. We'll talk about development management. It's been a mixed bag. A mixed bag. Development management literature has largely been focused on how to make institutions um, and institutional capacity better in the global south, right? Increased effectiveness, greater legitimacy, all of these sorts of things. There are heavy ties between development management literature and practices and ties to foreign development aid, which over time we have learned is not always the best approach. It can cause graft and corruption. There's a lot of mismanagement. And in some senses, it removes the incentive structure to improve the tax base, right? Which is a clear signal of state legitimacy. And so when you're just constantly giving donations or handouts, etc., it removes that incentive, right? To try and provide a efficient and well managed and legitimate institutional setting where people are willing to pay their taxes and where the state has the capacity to collect taxes, right? And I would say see Easterly's article from 2006 that they cited here. Easterly is a fantastic researcher, and that review is an excellent, excellent review of some of the problems and potential solutions of this development management literature. All right. So generally, we can see development management through two lenses. The first is just the mechanics of implementation of some new project or policy or whatever it might be. These are the procedures, the programs, projects, etc. The second lens is management for development, and they say it addresses the underlying substance of development as a transformational process that improves the well-being of citizens. Right. So while this approach has sometimes gone horribly awry, it is based in trying to help make things better, right? And so, like I would say, just be careful. Like I think the intention is good, but there are some severe misunderstandings about how this works in reality. All right, some examples that have and have not worked: HIV programs and AIDS programs, and epidemiological spread studies, and vaccination programs, and malaria nets, etc. These are generally considered to be the ideal cases, right? They work, they are effective. We have reduced things like HIV spread dramatically. Life expectancy in places like sub-Saharan Africa have increased pretty dramatically. Vaccination programs obviously help, right? Now, where these have not always helped and sometimes made things worse: poverty reduction, food assistance, especially in humanitarian crises, microfinancing, right? There's some good and some bad in there. The Nobel Prize was handed out for work on microfinancing in the early 2000, I think around 2010-ish. Um, Water and energy projects, right, which can many times be tied to sort of religious organizations, which can cause tensions, education, and lots more. All right, section 28.2, perspectives on development management. So what is it? It's rooted in what we call modernization theory, right? Some theoretical works that were coming out in sort of, I don't know, the 30s to the 60s that says um, a little a little bit optimistically and a little bit like just wrong, that states move in a linear fashion from developing to middling to developed countries, right? And you can also see Wallerstein. Wallerstein in the 70s wrote about it's not this development versus developed countries, it's about the core versus the periphery, and the core sort of keeping the periphery for extractive purposes and et cetera, right? So there are different perspectives on how this plays out. It's generally approached through sort of the Western lens, right? Meritocracy, bureaucratic efficiency, the rational approach to appraisal, implementation, and then evaluation, right? All of these things. Um, we can point to a few ideal cases where this has in many ways played out the way that they expected or the way that they were sort of promoting, right? So you could see states like Japan or South Korea as sort of the ideal golden cases. I would point to places like South America, where it's sort of middling, right? And this is mixed because they didn't take the same economic approach as much of the rest of the world, like the Asian market did. The Asian market took what's called the export oriented approach. Build manufacturing, sell out like cheap to middling goods, use that money to reinvest, and then eventually produce microchips and some of the world's best technology, right? Like that's the trajectory of Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, etc. In South America, they took a different approach called import industrialization. So, excuse me, ISI, import substitution industrialization. And this is the idea that you put up big barriers to trade, you throw money at corporate industry or like major industry leaders in each sector of the economy. You produce a completely sort of internal economy, um, and then you progress that way. But it's a disaster, right? ISI did not work. In many ways, America is moving toward ISI as the rest of the world is, which is troubling. It removes all of the incentives to compete in the international market. It removes all of the incentives to reinvest into your research and development, labor, and sort of human capital, all of these sorts of things, right? Because the government's just throwing money at them and protecting them from the international market. So it didn't work, but you know they took a different approach. So like it sort of substantiates the this modernization theory, right? Because you can point to Asia and say they did something different, point to South America and say, they didn't take the approach that was sort of suggested and it failed. But then you can look at Africa and just say, like, this didn't work at all, right? No matter what kind of approach they took, because they took a random assortment of approaches from communist to socialist to ISI to export oriented to everything, right? None of it worked. And there are a tiny handful of good examples in Africa, but for the most part, they have certainly not seen this modernization path, right? And there are a few reasons here, again, right? They have the resource curse. This is the problem with the Middle East, too. The resource curse that says if you have resources, then the state doesn't have to keep their citizens happy and doesn't need taxes to run itself, right? They have resource money by which they can sort of run themselves. But this leads to a dearth of human rights, democratic practices, etc. We have ethnic conflict. We know there's been a lot of ethnic conflict because of colonial map making and tensions and unfair distribution of resources and trying to build up one region over others, and I mean lots and lots and lots of different reasons for ethnic conflict. You've got the historical scars of colonialism, right? Extraction, sometimes brutal violence and sort of subhumanism. Um, and also they purposely did not build up the infrastructure of these states. They only built up the infrastructure to extract from these regions. So it was very much focused on like a center city, and then a route to a port, and that's pretty much all they built, right, under the colonial system. Um, and then finally, we have education and health, right? They don't have tax resources. They don't have um, real institutions in many senses to be able to provide education and health. And so this also tends to hold back the labor force and all kinds of other problems, right? All right. The middling path, right? We just talked about the good, sort of the Asian, stars, and we talked about Latin America as mostly a failure because of ISI, and we talked about the many, many problems with trying to develop Africa. But there is sort of a middling path that's rising in legitimacy called the BRICS, right? It started out as like 5 or 6 states: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, right? BRICS. But now it's added a whole bunch. There's like, I don't know, in the mid 20s, maybe 30s. I'm not exactly sure of the total number. But so yeah, you've got China, Russia, India, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, a whole bunch of middling countries, right? Which are trying to be sort of developed, quote unquote, um, but they haven't sort of done it on the same path or trajectory or timeline that states like Japan or South Korea have. Okay, modernization theory is at this point in our um, I don't know, our research paradigm of political science. It's not really thought very highly of these days. It's thought pretty archaic and simplistic, right? And at times it's thought of as a little bit like racist or supremacist, right? Like let's copy and paste our white sort of institutions onto cultures that don't necessarily don't necessarily uh, have a history for that, or that there are tensions with culture, religious, and Western ideas about institutionalization. And a lot of this modernization theory is pretty either forgetful of or forgiving of the colonial history that built up these Western developed states, right? And so, yes, the United States didn't participate in too much of that, but most of Europe did, right? From Portugal, Spain, Germany, the UK Empire, um, God, Denmark. There are a lot, right? And so, like, the history is very different, and the world looks very different now. And so, there's a lot of sort of, I don't know, turning a blind eye to how the Western world got to be developed, right? I would also point out sort of the final piece of this little section is that there is a very high correlation between being quote unquote developed and number one, colonialism, like we just discussed, and number two, the Marshall Plan, right? And NATO, and the United States picking and choosing which states we wanted to be successful in strategic spots around the planet versus which states could sort of be left behind, right? And so, like Japan, South Korea, and then many of the European states were very much a focus of the Marshall Plan. Um, and this, in many ways, sort of not only bolstered their ability to develop economy and their access to resources to develop economy, but also legitimized them on the international scene. And some say that they got advantage in international institutions that those states that were not sort of seen through the Marshall Plan lens did not get, right? Okay. Section 28.3, a multi-dimensional definition of development management. Number one, a means to institutional agendas, right? Research shows that donors have a lot of power in setting the agenda and even writing the rules around development programs. But often this is only on paper, right? There are many actors involved. There's been a lot of theft and corruption, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about cultural practices and things like this, right? All right, number two, whose values are we prioritizing, right? And so there can be a major tension between the Western perspective of trying to quote unquote improve cultures or whatever, right? Through things like human rights or women's rights, expansion of their rights, all of these sorts of things, right? And I'm not saying that they're right or wrong, but things like going into, say, an Islamist state and saying, like, we have to change all the rules around how your society and culture looks at women, how they're educated, how they participate in the labor force, all of these sorts of things are very, very touchy subjects, right? And trying to sort of just walk in and say, my money is going to buy you a whole new culture is a troubling concept, right? Sometimes, additionally, resources are doled out disproportionately to different religious or ethnic groups. And this can cause major tensions too, right? If we're only sort of going in on the ground and trying to improve the lives of Christians or Muslims or Jewish people or whatever it might be, to the detriment of other communities, this can actually make things a lot worse on the ground, right? Okay. Number three, planning and management toolkit. Again, a lot of this stuff is very Western centric, about how do we construct our institutions, how do we build our laws, how do we dole out resources, how do we use models to appraise and assess and evaluate all of these things, right? And oftentimes, these are based on sort of the rationalist model and based around numbers, right? Like, how does this improve GDP or educational outcomes or whatever? But sometimes the culture doesn't prioritize those things, right? Okay, number four, processes see the same as above. All right, section 28.4, development management debate. So there's really like three strands of approaches to this development management, right? And it lays out on a spectrum, right? From positivists who think that, like, okay, look at the health outcomes we've been able to achieve through vaccination programs and like AIDS detection and things like this. And they'll point out these ideal cases and say, like, look, this worked, right? And they'll say, like, this is a moral necessity, right? We need better environmental stuff. We need better rights for women and children. We need all of these things, right? We need better educational outcomes and like all of it, right? And so, like, I do think it comes from generally a good place, right? And so those are the positivists, right? On the very end of the other side of the spectrum, you have the rejectionists, right? Who say that this is no more than neocolonialism, and it does more harm than good. And sometimes it can cause ethnic tensions and even ethnic violence, or religious violence, or whatever it might be, right? And sometimes you're propping up dictators, and all of these kind of problems, right? So you have the positivists on one end, the rejectionists on the other end, and in the middle you have the reformists, right? And they say, look, there are serious issues, right? And this can cause some serious problems, and we have seen this go wildly awry in the real world in some cases, right? But we are learning, and we are contextualizing, and we are rejecting some of the worst approaches to these things, right? And in some sense, some of these states need the help, right? It's just we've got to be careful and thoughtful about how we do that, right? Okay. Let's see. Section 28.6, framing international development in policy implementation, right? So we need to improve a few things. And first, what we can do is build legitimacy, right? And I think this is an important piece in, especially if you're working with international NGOs or something like that, or the State Department or this kind of stuff, right? We need some local population buy-in. And this doesn't mean just the leaders or the politicians or whatever. Like we need on the ground community workers or um, I don't know, priests and imams, and local teachers and principals from schools and all of these sorts of things, right? We need more local input and less like here's the West telling you what to do, right? We need good monitoring and fair distribution. Ensure that like if you're I don't know in I don't know, Kenya, right, or Nigeria. You uh, implement it fairly. You distribute the program fairly. Um, you get money out to all the groups like the IBA, the Iwo, the Yoruba, all of these, right? That it's fair and distributed properly. That there's not regional tensions, right? We're just trying to build up the capital city, but most of one racial population or another lives in that city. So there are questions about fairness, right? All of these sorts of things and getting local input about those things can be very important, right? And there can be some extreme misunderstanding if you haven't lived in these places your whole life, right? And what looks like you favoring one group or another through the eyes of the locals, right? In some sense, we need some information dissemination, right? You need to help legitimize some of these organizations, explain what their purpose is, how they're being fairly distributed, what our goals are, and when we will just walk away if things will go wrong, all of these sorts of things. Okay, number two, you need to build constituencies. A lot of this touches on what I just talked about. Number three, you need to accumulate resources. And the locals need to have a stake in this, right? There needs to be maybe part of the revenue stream comes from local sources. Maybe it comes from local taxation. Maybe it comes from, I don't know, government grants, even though that's weird because, like, we're giving you money and then you're claiming that you're putting it back into the program, right? Like, I don't really know how we completely fix this, but the local elites and political class and media and all of it and citizens need a stake in this, right? You need to build an incentive structure to eventually pay for the projects, right? And this is part of that sort of what we were talking about early in the chapter, where corruption or graft or whatever, or just like freebies all the time, destroys the incentive structure around legitimizing these things, making them long term, improving their efficacy, all of this, right? And again, I would say that taxes are probably better than handouts or money from like oil or gold or diamonds or mining or whatever it might be, right? Um, a strong tax base and increasing effectiveness in collection is a signal that your state is doing well. I know taxes are a pain in the ass, right? But without them, you don't really have a state. You have fiefdoms or whatever. I don't know, an enormous black market. This will help build in accountability, functioning institutions, long term legitimacy, all of these things, right? And eventually it will bring expertise to the locals and they can sort of take over the model. Okay, number four, modifying organizational structures. This one I'm going to push back a little bit on. This can be very touchy or questionable, especially when we're discussing external or local organizations, right? Trying to come in with donor money and saying, okay, we're going to change the approach to all of this, right? Can cause problems, can cause real problems. It can go around institutions and delegitimize them. That can be very problematic, right? There are generally local customs and cultures about how these things work. Um, there are local dispute resolution systems that you may not know about because maybe they're not institutionalized. And if you're going around them, then you're going to cause tensions. Often, institutions can be based on religious thought, right? And centuries of religious history, right? So if you look at some of the sort of court systems, the taxation systems, the Ummah, the governance structures of Islam, they look very different from Western institutions. And to come in and say, like, we need you to Westernize these, is never going to fly, right? Um, and maybe we need to learn to work within those institutional structures like Islamist courts or Islamist banking, which doesn't even use interest rates, right? They have laws against usury, which is completely antithetical to the Western sort of economic model, right? And so just coming in and saying you got to change all this shit can be very, very, very touchy stuff, right? Okay, the fifth is mobilizing resources, and the sixth is monitoring impacts. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for being here. I think this is really a great thing to be aware of and to have deeper knowledge of this development management stuff if you have any intentions of doing anything international, either with a corporation, with the State Department, or other departments of the US government, or with sort of internationalized NGOs, right? Okay, thank you so much. Have a great day.